Yes, well, so we shot for 14 years. Mythbusters is in pretty much every country in the world that has internet or television. It was a phenomenal run. We stopped shooting about 2 years ago. And since that time, I've actually been delighted to stop being in front of the camera and being a trained monkey for doing goofy stuff. And I'm actually doing real work in industry. I guess at present we've converted the shop into, well, we're doing things for the military, we're doing things for firefighting devices and stuff like that. But in a nutshell, because of the notoriety that I have, a lot of companies, including Ben and the BIC, have reached out to me. We had, relative to the BIC, in fact, somebody from Australia, a government agency, had reached out because they were concerned. They're fairly aggressive about putting in, solar and battery power sources. They have a lot of homes that are out in the outback or wherever, and the government's been very supportive of renewable electricity technology. And so they were concerned that if all these batteries are showing up in these different places, what can happen? What if it's too hot, which often is in certain areas there? What if there's a flood, or what if they mount one of these batteries in a garage and back into it with a trailer hitch on their car? How do they anticipate those kinds of things and put regulations for how they're installed? How do they inform first responders on how to deal with those things when they see them? And so they had approached me on understanding that I'm pretty good at being destructive and testing things. We batted it around. I eventually decided, though, to forward them to the BIC, which that's what they do. And because Australia didn't have a thing like that, I was like, they were going to ship all these batteries up to me, and I was game for it. But clearly there is a need for things like the BIC to be able to properly test this kind of stuff. And I don't know, I haven't followed up with Ben on whether that actually went anywhere, but it does point out that this is a disruptive technology that needs to be adapted to, and so it only makes sense to have some sort of coordinated entity that can unbiasedly deal with these kinds of things and support them. Otherwise, what I'm doing is primarily for the military. We're developing other than the military, and I can't talk about that too much. We're doing some counter drone work, but we've developed a device to deal with some of the fires that we're having in the West. And currently, when they get to a certain size, the fire departments just have to let them do what they're going to do. And it's unfortunate if it's bad enough that forests are burning and whatnot, but eventually those fires end up in a neighborhood, and they can't do anything. You can't get in front of the fire. It's this last run that we had was the wind was moving at about 40 miles an hour, and so was the fire. So by the time people got notified that they were at risk, it was too late, and there were thousands of homes that were burned up. So what I've developed is a variation of an armored personnel carrier that's been put on remote control and has about 1,000 gallons of water on it. It's a tracked vehicle. It doesn't have a gun on it, but what we put is remote controlled spray guns and all this water, and we're using the water as a heat sink to run water through that is floating around in the bilge of this thing. These are amphibious, so they're basically boats. Boats have bilge pumps. We're letting a couple hundred gallons of coolant flow around in there, and then we pump it through the main 1,000-gallon tank to chill it and then spray it everywhere. So this is basically a robot with a rainstorm inside. We also have heat-proofing panels on it and so on. One interesting thing that we were concerned about, which is relevant to this group in terms of innovation and use of electric systems, is that we were concerned about what would happen if we have an oxygen deprivation situation and the diesel goes down. It has a large, mean diesel in there that requires a lot of air and so on. So oxygen deprivation is something that can happen. Well, I had looked into converting it into a hybrid, and we could have done that, but it would have roughly doubled the costs of the conversion. So what we've opted to do instead is take a Zero motorcycle. That's an electric motorcycle company that has been fairly successful in the Bay Area, and we're using. We found it's most economical to just buy the whole motorcycle, and we're using the motor and the speed controller and the battery to power the water pump that supplies the foam and water for fighting the fire. So if our engine dies, we can protect ourselves, is the point. The other thing that we're doing is using yet another Zero motorcycle motor and speed controller that's hooked up on a PTO off the main diesel to charge that battery. And so that battery, which can run one of these motorcycles for about, I believe it's a 150-mile range or something like that, will serve to, basically cover us in a big pile of firefighting foam until the oxygen comes back and we can start the diesel. This just gives you an idea of the way that we're using these new technologies. You have these things pop up, like somebody wants an electric motorcycle, and then all of a sudden we found those batteries now that Zero manufacturers are ending up in VTOL airplanes that are your personal flying car that's electric in the Bay Area. We're finding them used in go-karts and all sorts of other things. So technology, especially when it comes to these electrics, is just it's exploding, and it's creeping into all these different things, which I find personally exciting. In the Bay Area, the one outfit that's using the Joby, or using the Zero motorcycle batteries, is Joby Aviation, and they've now got a multi-rotor transitioning aircraft, meaning that it can take off in VTOL mode and then use wings to fly forward with it, because the rotors tilt. It's called vector thrust, and they're looking at 200-mile range at 200 miles an hour, and I think they're actually looking above that now. But that's pretty impressive that you can do that. You can imagine, being stuck in traffic. 200-mile. Most people don't commute more than 200 miles on a day, but now you could live, someplace in upstate New York or wherever it is, and commute to Manhattan and not use any fossil fuels. It's pretty amazing. So what they've done is taken advantage of the developments that Zero did in these prismatic batteries that they've refined, and they've got a whole bank of them. And, it's this big block, but it's I believe it's a 4-passenger aircraft. It'll be a little pricey, obviously, but right now in the Bay Area, there are 2 other companies that I know of that are doing that. There's Kitty Hawk, which is doing a smaller single-person version of it. There's Zero, which has something in between, and at the same time in the Bay Area, we have Zero motorcycle, we have Alta motorcycles, we've got Proterra buses, we've got the Farasis prismatic battery company, and it's just exploding. And I've been to all of those places. A lot of them have reached out, and I've noticed things like what's up on the screen right now is that's a Tesla pack, and so we've there's an ongoing controversy, and this is the kind of thing I find fascinating, trying to look at the big picture with these things, seeing how some of this stuff is evolving at this ridiculous pace. That Tesla battery pack Proterra, by the way, is doing the same thing, but with several, the equivalent of several of those things. So there are thousands of these little 18650 cells that they've decided is the way to go. And they talk about the reasons for that. You know, the cell size is small, which makes it easy to inhibit an escalation, which is, you know, obviously a concern with lithium, and that makes sense. It's also seen as a commodity, so they can count on the quality of it. They can buy it they can be guaranteed they can buy it at a competitive price because of that. But when you think about, and also they've solved the problem of all these little cells that have to be handled with robots. So you get the batteries in boxes, and then they have robots that, you know, that pick them up and stack them, and you put them in larger bricks and larger bricks and larger bricks until you end up with a battery like that. You know, so they have their reasons for it, and Alta Motorcycles does the same thing with their packs, and they make an argument that these motorcycles, you know, which are often more exposed to damage than automobiles, it makes sense to have a cell that you can be guaranteed is going to have good quality control, and that you can control or inhibit an escalation with it. But on the other hand, Zero has decided to use the prismatic cells like that one, and they also have employed a number of strategies for inhibiting them, including basically what they do is stack these things together in a block and cast them in epoxy along with their BMS systems and so on. And they've had good results with them. And you can see the advantage of the prismatics are that you can have fewer of those cells. They pack more. Well, basically the energy density is going to be higher because of the fact that they're flat, and they can pack in a box where all these little cylinders have all this extra space and a lot of additional material in them that is not energy storage, all of the casings and all those kinds of things. So there are all these pluses and minuses with these different systems, and it's sort of a battle. Personally, I think the prismatics are going to win out. I think it's only a question of time. This next thing is something that the lead engineer that developed the batteries for Zero came up with this idea of layering these the different materials in a cell in this fashion. If you can flip to the next package or next photo, he just proposes putting this in the wings of aircraft for electric aircraft, because there's all this space that you could lie these flat layers out in, and again reduce the total amount of non-energy storage mass that you have in a cell. So it makes sense, I guess. And I'm pointing all these things out because you know, when you look at the pace of this kind of innovation and where these things are happening out in the Bay Area, it's this kind of it's actually it's scary to watch it, because it just is it's going everywhere. It's you know, people are doing all sorts of things with it. I as an interesting story, I have an intern that showed up from a robotics company called 3D Robotics out there, and this is a 19-year-old kid that we've got doing flight control software for some of the drone work we're doing, and he had also been working for yet another company called Elroy that is doing VTOL aircraft. Their particular thing is for cargo VTOLs that are carrying things up to like around in excess of a 500-pound payload. The military is main customer for that, I believe, and they're actually moving ahead at quite a faster speed than some of the personnel carrying VTOL flying car versions are, because they don't have people on them and they don't have some of the same constrictions. But anyway, this 19-year-old kid was doing the flight controllers for them. He doesn't have a college degree. he goes down to Stanford occasionally and sits in on some of the classes and listens in. But basically, he's managed to get himself in as an intern at all these different companies that are doing this stuff, and he's loving it. What he did when he showed up at my shop was that along with doing the coding for our flight controller setup, he ended up buying a boat and taking one of the drone motors that he had acquired. It was a model that they decided not to use on the Elroy aircraft, and this is a 40 kilowatt motor that's about this big. Weighs like, I think it must be about 25 or 30 pounds or something. Well, yeah, something like that, maybe 25 pounds. And he had bought this old sailboat that was a project boat that somebody had, and so he picked it up for a song, and they had to get it off the dock. The diesel was sitting on the dock and was a rusted lump, and so this kid looked at the RPM volts, the kV on the motor, and looked at what the diesel was. And he talked to me because I'm an old charter boat captain from way back, and I told him, yeah, well, gee, so there's this 25-pound thing that has almost exactly the same horsepower and speed of rotation that the output of 500 or 600 pound diesel that is a rusted lump on the dock did. And so I helped him. He stuck that little outrunner motor right on the prop shaft going into the boat, and instead of a big lump where the diesel was, he's got extra space, flat space. He's mounted the battery in the bilge where the diesel tank was, and he's quite happy with it. In those kinds of situations, and this is the other thing that I'm seeing with some of this new technology, motorcycles are a good choice. Teslas and things like that are, I drive a Tesla, but I have to be careful where I go with it. I can't just take off across country. I can if I trust the superchargers and all that kind of stuff. And it works for me with my particular circumstances. But a motorcycle, you're generally not making that kind of run. You want it for sport, for taking out on the weekend, for commuting in a city with heavy traffic, and they're short runs. It totally makes sense. No maintenance, no muss, no fuss, no noise, no mess. And in the case of something like a boat, this is a sailboat that the guy got, and so those diesels are thought of as auxiliaries that get the boats in and out of a harbor or something like that, and then you sail. Totally makes sense. So I see all these kinds of new technologies adapting like this, and it's just fascinating to watch these people like these kids that are just like, well, why don't I put that thing here or do this or that with it? You've got batteries, you've got speed controllers, you can make all sorts of things happen that didn't exist just a few years ago. We didn't have any of these possibilities. And you also look at the way that they're competing with other technologies. Another company that reached out to me not long ago was Cummins Engine Company, or Cummins Westport specifically, which is doing renewable natural gas diesels, where they've converted diesels to run off of essentially methane, whether it's from the ground or renewable. The main thing that is the innovation with them is that they're extremely efficient, and they've been able to post-process the gases to where they're able to say that the cleanest diesels on the planet. I went to Proterra in San Francisco Bay Area and was like, we should do an article about the pluses and minuses on this. And they didn't want to do it. They think electricity is and lithium batteries is the only way to go, and more power to them. But Cummins, you look at the way they're dealing with it. They've also developed electric powered trucks, and beat Tesla to the punch with that. And yet at the same time, they're not throwing out the old technologies completely. they're just modifying them to where they're cleaner. So I see all of this kind of in one kind of worldview, because these companies reach out to me. I'm a paid spokesperson now for Cummins. A lot of people don't know I grew up. In fact, Cummins didn't know that I grew up in Columbus, Indiana. So, and in fact, in the boyhood home of one of their founders. So it was funny that they reached out to me about this, because we did a funny, we did a thing that's online now showing me standing next to the rear end of a cow, squirting out manure and talking about how that makes renewable gas. It's as dirty as the manure is, the renewable gas is quite clean, and so on. So looking at it from that perspective, seeing how all these companies are adapting, are creating new things, are moving at such an extraordinary pace is really exciting to me personally. And watching also something pop up like the BIC here, which is designed to facilitate that and coordinate it, help these companies out, I think it's fantastic, and I hope that BIC does really well. Thank you.